Mr. Jinnah, good to have you with us this afternoon. How would you describe the aftermath of the Arab Spring on Libya?
I think Libya was one of three countries that spiraled very quickly after the uprisings began into civil war. The other two being Syria and Yemen. Libya has not pulled itself out of that, although in the past few months we are seeing some positive signs. So what we had before that was effectively Libya was broken up into two, some might argue three parts. It had two governments, two heads of those governments, two parliaments, one in the east, one in the west, and dozens or scores of militias all over the country, the largest militia being one based in the east, that of General Khalifa Haftar. Over the past few months, what we've seen is that to an extent, as a result of kind of war weariness, there are some positive signs. And of course, one should say that the role of the United Nations envoys, more than one, successive envoys, have also played a role in that, in bringing the sides to the table so that we have a possibility right now that we might, over the course of this year or early next year, find some kind of a peaceful resolution to what is happening in Libya. But things were extremely bad, and there was actually a chance that the country might split into two.
So let's talk about these centers of power, Mr. Jinnah. They have their own militaries, they've got their own mercenaries, but they also have their own foreign backers. Talk to us about the centers of power that exist in Libya right now.
Well, the foreign backers issue has been a big problem for the past decade. As you said in your introduction, the uprisings began in Libya, and very quickly foreign powers kind of inserted themselves into it. We had NATO, which came in with a huge bombing campaign. I mean, Tripoli was carpet bombed for long periods of time by NATO forces, the Americans, and thereafter British and French in particular. When the uprisings began in the east, in Benghazi, the city of Benghazi in particular, we found suddenly French flags flying all over the place. So from the beginning, there was this kind of attempt by foreign forces to take control of what was initially a popular uprising. Fast forward to, let's say, the past year or past 2 years, and we find that a number of foreign forces are involved. So certainly the French are very much still involved, supporting the government in the east, or the parliament in the east, and particularly Khalifa Haftar. The Italians are involved in supporting the government in Tripoli. The government in Tripoli is one that is recognized by the United Nations, came out of talks that took place in Morocco. Then we have other foreign forces. Russia has been for a while on the fence, and then began supporting Haftar and the Eastern government. The United States officially has supported the UN-recognized government in Tripoli, but Donald Trump occasionally expressed support for the other side, which didn't make too much of sense. And then in the region itself, different powers have taken positions. So the United Arab Emirates is very much involved in supporting the government in the east, the Khalifa Haftar government, as is Egypt, which lies on the eastern side of Libya. Turkey, on the other hand, is supporting the UN-backed government in Tripoli. So all of these forces are involved in the country, and all of these forces have their own agendas and own objectives for why they're supporting whichever side they are. Libya remains, despite what you said, and you were correct about poverty in Libya, but Libya remains an extremely rich country. It has a great deal of oil resources, now gas resources as well. Its oil is the kind of quality that is used in jet fuel, so it's sought after. It is a rich country, but the war has left the country impoverished, and the role of foreign actors has added to that problem.
Well, I guess the land is rich, the country is rich, but its people certainly are not. Who are the main players who are eyeing that oil?
Well, it's the United States and Russia. That's two of the further placed powers. In Europe, it's France and Italy in the main, but other countries as well. And then Turkey, you know, one of the reasons for Turkey's involvement is the Mediterranean Sea, its access to the Mediterranean, and its gas resources there. The UAE and Egypt are less interested in the oil and more interested in kind of control over the country for various geopolitical reasons.
It is very strategic. You mentioned there the interest in the Mediterranean, but we've also seen the Mediterranean be the place where so many Libyans have drowned, as there is an exodus from the country, people trying to flee the country to go into Europe. Talk to us about that dynamic.
Well, in reality, it's not that there have been large numbers of Libyans that have drowned. There have been, of course, some. But Libya has been for many years the kind of transit point for many refugees, whether political or economic refugees from different parts of Africa, to try and get to Europe. When Muammar Gaddafi was in power, one of the things he did was made a deal with the Europeans. And the deal was that he would prevent African migrants from going over to Europe, and Europeans kind of rewarded him for that. When he was killed and the civil war began, that kind of left those floodgates open. You know, he wasn't there, of course, to be faithful to that deal, and so we found lots of, in particular, using Libya as that kind of transit point to try and get to Europe. And it is many of these people from, not so much from Libya itself, or not Libyans, but from sub-Saharan Africa, that have been the victims of the Mediterranean and the victims of people smugglers. Hundreds who have departed from Libya have been killed in the Mediterranean. And of course, for European powers, particularly, for example, Italy, this is the other big issue. Doesn't concern the UAE or Egypt or Turkey, Russia or the US as much, but it certainly concerns the countries on the northern part of the Mediterranean, this issue of migration and the role that Libya could play, as it had been playing in Gaddafi's time, to prevent African migrants from getting to Europe. And so what Italy would like, for example, is a stable government that would be able to, again, go back to that kind of situation where migrants would not be allowed to cross. This is for these southern European countries in particular, but Europe in general, this is a big issue and a big concern regarding Libya.
Mr. Janabi, before I let you go, what needs to happen for the quality of life of Libyans to improve?
Well, I think that the processes that are underway at the moment, as I said at the beginning, leaves one with a great deal of optimism. There certainly is a passion, both from the UN-recognized government in Tripoli, as well as the government in Tobruk in the east, except for Khalifa Haftar, who commands the largest of the militias in Libya, except for him, because he really wants to continue the civil war and wants to militarily take over Tripoli, which he failed to do over the past few years. But the parliament that's based in Tobruk, the government and the parliament that's based in Tripoli, all are keen to find some solution. They're sitting together, they're looking at solutions that will include kind of unity governments, unity parliaments, etc. And I think that with the guidance of the UN in particular, that this process is moving forward. If we have a unified government, the next step, well, not the next step, but in parallel to that, would be to try and bring the militias under some kind of umbrella within the structures of that government, within a Libyan army or whatever the case would be. But it would be useless to have a unified government, but hundreds of militia running around all over the place armed. So that is the kind of task in parallel to setting up a government or moving towards elections. The parallel task is to bring the militias under control, and I think that that's what's being done. So once those two processes come together, the political and the security, I think the economic issues will follow without a great deal of difficulty thereafter. And you'd be able to see a Libya that will be able to, in a sense, exhibit its wealth as it did in the past, but a Libya that is democratic. This is no longer a kind of fantasy or pipe dream. It can be possible within the next year and a half.
Mr. Jamar, thank you so much for your time as well as on your insight on Libya as it stands 10 years after the Arab Spring. That's Mr. Naeem Jinnah there. He is Executive Director of the Afro-Middle East Center. 10 years after the Arab Spring, and still the freedom and the progress that the Libyans were hoping for. Well, I guess Mr. Jinnah says they're perhaps closer than they were before to that.